Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Morgan Foley, and this is my colleague Emily Scholten on the line as well. You should be seeing both of us. Emily and I are both immigration lawyers at McInnes Cooper, both based actually in our St. John, New Brunswick office, although we do have offices all around the Atlantic region. And we both practice immigration law. So we're here today to talk specifically with respect to options for immigration in Atlantic Canada. And this is intended to be a bit of a virtual roundtable session. So please, if you have questions as we're going along, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll try to save, we intend to save time at the end. We'll try to save the questions at the end to address those all together. We also have a number of questions that came in from registrants in advance of the session, so we will also address those. So we'll jump right in and get started. As far as kind of setting the scene for today's discussion, and Emily is in charge of our slides today, I'll get you just to jump to the next one for me, if you would, please. No, that's perfect, thanks. So as far as our plan for our discussion today, as I mentioned, we intend to speak specifically about the Atlantic region, and also when we think about immigration to Canada in general, you can think of it as sort of three categories of application streams, if you will. There are family class applications. So those are applications typically for permanent residency based on your relationship with a Canadian. So spousal sponsorships, the sponsorship of parents or dependent children, those types of family class applications. That's sort of one category on its own. A second category would be refugee applications. So those who are making a refugee claim and making a permanent residency application to Canada on the basis of that refugee claim. That is really a category in and of itself as well. And the third category would be what we refer to as economic classes of applications. The majority of applicants for permanent residency in Canada fall under the economic class. And the focus of our discussion today will be on various pathways in Atlantic Canada that fall under that economic class umbrella. What do I mean when I say economic class? Well, you can think of it as applications that are based on your ability to integrate into the Canadian workforce, the majority of which are employer supported or require varying degrees of involvement from a person's employer. And they also require things like English or French language skills, particular levels of education. Age is often a factor. Work experience, both inside and outside of Canada, is a factor. So all of those economic factors that play a part in how a person might contribute to the Canadian labor market and what their ability to enter the workforce might be. Under that economic class, there are numerous application streams. In particular, the streams that we will talk about today in Atlantic Canada are the various provincial nominee programs. Now, every province in the country has a version of a provincial nominee program. Our focus will be on the Atlantic versions of those today, but just know that the other provinces have them as well. And also we'll be talking about the Atlantic Immigration Program. That is unique to the 4 Atlantic provinces. It has a lot of similarities with the provincial nominee programs in terms of how they are structured, but it is a unique stream that is only available in Atlantic Canada. And so then if we think of the advantages of the economic classes in Atlantic Canada and applications in Atlantic Canada in particular, some of the advantages that we've highlighted here on the screen. First of all, a job offer will be a requirement with very limited exceptions. That's true across the country, really, but it is something that is important to keep in mind throughout our discussion today, that there is, with few exceptions, a requirement for an offer from an employer in Atlantic Canada if you're applying in Atlantic Canada, or an employer in the province where you intend to be destined. There are typically faster processing times, which can be a major advantage in Atlantic Canada. Most of the applications we will discuss today happen in sort of a two-stage application process. So you're applying to the province, and then once you are approved at the provincial level, you're applying then for permanent residency at the federal level. Or for a work permit at the federal level. Now, many times the work permit and the PR application will go hand in hand. The major distinction when it comes to processing times at the Atlantic level is at that first stage. The provincial processing times tend to be shorter than in other provinces around the country. Once you have that provincial approval and you're submitting the federal portion of the application, at that point, the federal processing is the same across the country, kind of go into the same bucket of applicants who may have been nominated by another province, for example. But on the front end, there tends to be a shorter processing time. The exception there is Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia, being our largest Atlantic province, does typically have a longer processing time even at the provincial level. And at the federal level, a major difference is the Atlantic Immigration Program. Obviously, those are only applicants in Atlantic Canada. So even at the federal level, they are being processed only as Atlantic Canadian applicants. And the average processing right now is about 9 months at the federal level, compared with about 21 months under the provincial nominee programs at the federal level. So you can see a bit of that Atlantic advantage there as well, as far as the overall processing time. Another potential major advantage in Atlantic Canada is that there are opportunities for Tier 4 and 5 positions. For anyone who may not be aware, the federal government categorizes all jobs in Canada according to a tier system. The tier system represents the skill level of the position. It goes from 0 through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 0 being the highest, 4 and 5 being the lowest skilled. So 0, 1, 2, and 3 are all considered high skilled or intermediate skilled positions, typically requiring some level of education beyond secondary school. So that could be college training, it could be post-secondary education, it could be postgraduate education. The 0 tier also is for managerial level positions. Tiers 4 and 5, in many cases, can be excluded, especially when we look at other provinces in Canada, from the pathways to permanent residency. So being the lower skilled roles, they are not always included as eligible for pathway to permanent residency. If you look at the federal express entry system, for example, work experience in Tier 4 and 5 positions is not qualifying work experience. So it can be a bit more challenging to find a pathway to PR if your job offer is in a Tier 4 or 5 position. However, in Atlantic Canada, for the most part, there are some opportunities for Tier 4 and 5 positions, which can make that particularly advantageous as well. Another potential major advantage is the fact that the AIP, the Atlantic Immigration Program, does not have an age max or cap. The majority of the provincial nominee programs, including the provincial nominee programs in Atlantic Canada, do have an upper age limit. And so for those who are, generally older than 55 or 59, depending on the province, that can be a barrier to applying to permanent residency. under the AIP, that limit does not exist. And then, more generally, if we look outside of the pure application stream advantages, if we look at, Atlantic Canada in general, typically a lower cost of living, although it is increasing just like it's increasing around the world, we do still typically have a lower cost of living as compared to the rest of Canada. Certainly very welcoming communities. Maybe we're biased as Atlantic Canadians with that description there, but I would certainly say that that's true, and we have a reputation for a reason in Atlantic Canada. And this will come up as well when I speak about the Atlantic Immigration Program with respect to settlement services that are built right into the AIP with the intention of improving settlement and retention of newcomers in Atlantic Canada, as historically we have been a part of Canada where there has been more movement. Someone might settle initially and then within the first 5 years relocate to some of the larger provinces like Ontario, British Columbia, etc. So we have tried to bake that into our AIP in order to improve settlements and reflect the fact that we do have very welcoming communities. So I'm going to take the lead and talk about the AIP initially, and then Emily will pick things up and look at each of the provincial nominee programs in Atlantic Canada. So I'll just jump right in and give a bit of an overview as far as how the Atlantic Immigration Program works. This first screen is just a quick little screen grab to show you the example we have on the screen is Newfoundland, but every province has a version of their own website with information about their application programs. You'll see snippets when Emily speaks about the websites for each province with respect to their provincial nominee programs. This is a snippet that shows the Atlantic Immigration Program website in Newfoundland. It has application guides, some information about the program and eligibility in general. So they are a good source of starting information. And also it's where you will go to actually make an application. So if you look on the right side of the screen, that Immigration Accelerator is Newfoundland's version of the online application portal where you would create an account, log in, submit the application. Every province has some version of that where they have an online intake process. And so the other thing I will note as well is every province does post a list of designated employers. Again, this is an example pulled from the Newfoundland website, but every province does have a version of this list. Some are PDFs that you can download that are updated as employers become designated under the program. I'll talk a little bit about what that means for an employer to become designated. Now, what I will note is these lists online are often mistaken as a list of employers who are actively recruiting and who are looking for new hires, looking to support individuals under the AIP. That is not always the case. Often an employer maybe became designated simply to support an existing employee under the program, or they became designated a couple years ago. They're no longer recruiting for a particular position. And what I will say from speaking to employers is they are often inundated with applicants who are sort of just sending applications to everyone on this list. And that is not how they go about making their hires, typically from people who are just seeking support under the AIP. So these lists, while they do exist and they could tell you whether or not your own employer is already designated, for example, they are not as helpful as they might appear if you are a job seeker who is looking to get a job offer from an employer who might then support you for permanent residency. So if we look at the AIP process, I've broken it down here in step-by-step format, and I'll just talk about each of these steps in a little bit of detail to describe the process. The AIP, as I mentioned, like the other programs in Atlantic Canada, it is really a three-stage process, the AIP, because the first step is that an employer has to become designated under the program, meaning they have to have provincial approval to use the AIP program. Now, once an employer becomes designated, they will remain designated short of losing that designation for failing to comply with the program requirements or something of that nature. But it's not a step that has to be taken for each individual applicant. Once the employer is designated, they will be a designated employer under the AIP and be able to then support one or more employees under the program. The endorsement is the second step of the application process, and the endorsement is specific to the individual. So a designated employer can apply to have an employee endorsed under the AIP. That is something that they would have to do for each individual applicant that they intend to support. So that sort of second step is relevant to all applicants. And then the third and final stage is, as I described, the federal portion of the application. So once an individual has that provincial endorsement for the approval from the province, they would be applying for their federal application with IRCC at the federal government level. So if we break that down a little bit, as shown on the screen here, employer designation, obviously that has to be the first step. If you are looking for a job in Atlantic Canada and the employer is already designated, then the AIP might be an option. Or if you have an employer who is willing to become designated, then the AIP might be an option for you. At its core, it is a permanent residency application, meaning the employer intends to support the individual for permanent residency in Canada. You'll note the settlement plan is sort of the second bubble here, and I made reference to that when I was describing the welcoming nature of Atlantic Canadian communities. So the settlement plan is a core component of the AIP. When the AIP was designed, it was designed, as I described, to attempt to retain more newcomers in Atlantic Canada. How do we do that? Well, hopefully by creating an environment where they are able to easily settle. So the settlement plan will identify settlement needs of an applicant and their family members. Maybe there's a need for language training. Maybe there's a need for help with things like opening a bank account, finding a physician, finding housing, transportation. It can be any number of things like that. And each settlement plan is unique to the applicant, but it does set out items that they may need assistance with and the extent to which an employer might be required to assist with those settlement needs. Once the person has a settlement plan, has an offer from a designated employer, and they intend to apply for endorsement, they submit that application to the province with things like proof of their related work experience, proof of their language skills in the form of an English or French test, proof of their education, etc. All of that kind of baseline criteria in terms of eligibility, both for the AIP, but also for the job that is being offered to them. Maybe their licensing requirements, etc., for that particular job. They submit that to the province. The province assesses the endorsement application, determines whether they are in fact qualified under the AIP and for the job. And then if it is approved, the applicant will be issued an endorsement certificate. With that endorsement certificate, they can do two things. They can apply for a work permit. So if you did not already have a work permit, or maybe your work permit will soon expire and will expire before the processing of the permanent residency application. Maybe you have a work permit for a different employer and you need to be authorized now to work for the employer who has supported your AIP application. So in any of those scenarios, a new work permit application could be made based on the endorsement. As well, the endorsement allows you to apply for permanent residency. So if you're already on, let's say, an open work permit, you're not restricted to a particular employer, you can work for your employer right away, but you're applying for permanent residency, you might skip the work permit application stage and just apply for permanent residency at the federal government level. And so the processing time, it's approximately 9 to 10 months right now. On average, again, these processing times do fluctuate and it is an average, but generally, once the permanent residency application is submitted, that is when the clock will start with the federal government's processing time of approximately 9 to 10 months. And so if we look just kind of briefly at the applicant's eligibility in terms of the AIP, again, it's going to depend on the job offer that you have, as well as the education that you have, because under the AIP, there is a requirement for 1 year of related work experience within the last 5 years. So 1 year of work experience that is related to the job offer you have obtained. The exception to that is if you are an Atlantic Canadian graduate who's graduated in the last 2 years. So if you've completed post-secondary education at an Atlantic Canadian institution, you've recently graduated, then you can apply without the work experience, just with the job offer from an employer who is designated and in Atlantic Canada. So that is, another major Atlantic Canadian benefit under the AIP when it comes to potentially graduates who are looking for job offers, but it is specific to Atlantic Canadian grads. Now, if we look sort of just briefly, we've broken down the minimum requirements. So in the top left, you'll see that the education minimums, it does depend on the tier level or the skill level of the job. So those higher tier, higher skilled 0 and 1, a minimum of 1 year of post-secondary education is required. The lower tiers, 2, 3, and 4, secondary or high school diploma is sufficient. You'll note that we don't have a reference to Tier 5 here. Tier 5 is not eligible under the AIP. So while there is eligibility under the PNP, which Emily will speak about, under the AIP, Tier 4 is the lowest eligible tier. Again, language minimums do depend on the tier level of the position. The CLB on the screen stands for Canadian Language Benchmark. So depending on the test that you take, that score can be converted into a Canadian Language Benchmark score. Minimum of 5 required for the majority of the tiers. Tier 4, it is the lower CLB of 4 that is the minimum requirement. Settlement plan is needed as discussed, and no age limit as we've discussed. The work experience we touched on there as far as the 1 year minimum with the exception of Atlantic Canadian graduates. And then the job offer itself does have to be a full-time, meaning at least 30 hours a week, non-seasonal job offer. For those higher tiers, 0, 1, 2, and 3, the offer has to be for at least 1 year after receiving permanent residency. So if you kind of do some quick math on that, you're going to have the processing time at the provincial level. You're then going to have close to a year, 9 to 10 months of processing at the federal level, and your job offer has to be for at least 1 year again beyond that decision date. If it is a tier 4 position, it must be a permanent offer of employment. Many programs do have proof of funds requirements, and if you were an applicant from outside of Canada or someone who's not currently working in Canada, the AIP would also have minimum proof of fund requirements. But if you are currently working, if you have a work permit and you're currently working in Canada, that proof of funds requirement is not existent for the AIP. And then just a couple of practical issues when it comes to using the AIP. Again, it is an employer-driven program. So as we've mentioned, that need for the employer's involvement is certainly there. As far as comparing with other pathways to permanent residency, it is the one that has the most employer involvement. In fact, that the employer does have to be designated, the employer has to be involved in the settlement plan process, etc. So that can sometimes be a downside to the program, depending on how willing your employer may be to participate in the program and their own eligibility to participate in the program. Um, Processing times, as far as we've discussed the processing times for the permanent residency, they are lower than others, so that is a benefit. But the processing times for the work permit, if you don't already have the authorization to work and you need to apply for an AIP work permit, processing times are lengthy for an online work permit application, and the AIP does not allow a port of entry work permit application, unlike some other programs where if you are visa exempt, you might be eligible to apply upon entry to Canada. Even visa exempt citizens are not eligible to apply at the port of entry under the AIP, which means you're forced to apply online and subjected to the longer processing times for the work permit. There is certainly a lot of documentation involved. Now, I would say, that is true of almost all permanent residency applications, that there is a significant amount of documentation. Something like the AIP and PNP, they require a lot of documentation upfront before you're even applying to the province. You have to have things like language tests completed, education assessments completed, etc. So that can sometimes be, it's document heavy on the front end. That can slow things down a bit if you have, an employer who wants you to start right away. You're trying to get an application in right away, but you're still organizing documents. And then again, red tape, like we discussed with respect to obtaining designation and settlement plan and whatnot. It is a document heavy and process heavy application. And so from there, I will let Emily take it over and talk to you about provincial nominee programs.
Thank you, Morgan. So I'm going to be speaking, like Morgan said, about the provincial nominee programs, also known as PNP, that are available in the Atlantic provinces. And PNP is similar to AIP in that it involves an application to the provincial government as the first piece. However, one difference is that instead of an endorsement certificate, if you're successful, you will receive a nomination certificate. And then with that nomination certificate, just like with AIP, you apply for PR with the federal government. And the purpose of PNP is to help provinces to nominate individuals who meet the province's specific needs for permanent residence. And in the next few slides, I'm going to be providing just a brief overview of how the different PNP streams work in each of the Atlantic provinces. So, like Morgan touched on, each province has their own or creates their own streams based on their specific labor and economic needs. These streams can be opened and closed at any time, and the requirements do change frequently. So, the best way to keep on top of these changes and the most reliable source for which pathways are active and what each pathway requires is through the province's immigration websites. So this is where updates will be posted and where the most reliable program requirements can be found. And the screen grab that I have on the screen right now is an example of what the Immigration New Brunswick website looks like. And then in addition to their websites, every province has their own online portal, which is where you will go when you are submitting an expression of interest for nomination for the PNP program. This is also where you would receive any invitations or correspondence from the province with respect to your application. So this screen grab on the slide is an example of what the online portal for New Brunswick looks like. And as is the case in most provinces, the majority of the provincial programs in New Brunswick are for workers. So that is a foreign national who is employed by or who has a job offer from an eligible employer who is willing to support their permanent residency application. There is one stream for self-employed individuals in New Brunswick, which is the New Brunswick Business Immigration Stream. But really, the majority of the province's focus is on bringing in-demand workers into Canada to work for existing employers. Within the specific employer streams, you have the New Brunswick Skilled Worker Stream, the New Brunswick Express Entry Stream, and the New Brunswick Strategic Initiative Stream. Every province has an express entry stream, which requires a candidate to apply through the federal express entry system and then apply to the province for nomination. If a candidate is nominated through the provincial piece of the express entry application, they receive additional points for their express entry application, which essentially guarantees that they will receive an invitation to apply under the federal express entry pathway for PR. And then within this express entry stream, there is the employment in New Brunswick pathway, which requires candidates to have been living and working in New Brunswick for 12 months in occupations with specified skill levels. And then there's also the New Brunswick interests pathway. And under this, candidates might receive a letter of interest from New Brunswick for meeting specified criteria. Um, and the New Brunswick interest pathway is unique because candidates don't necessarily need to have a job offer to qualify for that pathway. So um, it can be a good option if a candidate doesn't have a job offer yet. The New Brunswick skilled worker stream has seen some major changes recently. The province has split this stream into three pathways now, um, being the New Brunswick experience pathway, the New Brunswick graduates pathway, and the New Brunswick priority occupations pathway. However, the New Brunswick priority occupations pathway is currently closed. So, practically speaking, there are only really two pathways that are available at this time. To qualify for the New Brunswick Graduates Pathway, candidates need to have successfully completed a program of study that meets specific criteria at a designated learning institute in New Brunswick. And the New Brunswick Experience Pathway requires a candidate to have been living and working for an eligible employer in New Brunswick for at least 6 consecutive months. One positive of the NB experience pathway is that there's no specific requirements for tier categories. So there are opportunities for those tier 4 and 5 occupations under this pathway. And there are also lower language requirements under that pathway, as only a CLB of 4 is needed. And then finally, New Brunswick has a unique strategic initiative stream, which is for French speaking foreign nationals that have specific skills, education, and work experience that the government has identified as needed in New Brunswick. And those individuals also have to be working or willing to live and work in New Brunswick permanently. Um, and this stream is really based on the fact that the New Brunswick government is wanting to put more of an emphasis on bilingualism. So if you speak French, this stream is a good pathway to explore because there is a possibility of qualifying for this pathway as well without a job offer. So getting into Newfoundland, similar to New Brunswick, these are screen grabs from the immigration website for Newfoundland, as well as you'll see towards the bottom their online portal. Um, Similar to New Brunswick as well, Newfoundland places most of its emphasis on workers with employer-supported job offers, but there are two potential pathways for self-employed workers. One is a general pathway for entrepreneurs, and then one is specifically for entrepreneurs who are students that have graduated from either MUN or the College of the North Atlantic. And then, like New Brunswick, Newfoundland has an express entry stream, which is called the NLPNP Express Entry Skilled Worker category. It's very similar to New Brunswick in that you need to have an express entry profile in order to apply for provincial nomination there as well. And then Newfoundland also has two other non-express entry streams. Those are the skilled worker and the international graduate stream. So just like in New Brunswick, under the skilled worker stream, tier 4 and 5 occupations are eligible to apply here as well, as long as they have a full-time job offer and they meet the other eligibility criteria. The international graduate stream is a pathway available to international graduates who intend to make Newfoundland and Labrador their permanent home. So there are different requirements under this category based on whether a student attended MUN or the College of the North Atlantic, or if they attended another Canadian university outside of Newfoundland. So this is a screen grab as well from the Nova Scotia immigration website, where you can find up-to-date information on their programs. And then this is a screen grab from their online portal, which is where you would submit your application for Nova Scotia provincial nomination. You can also see that's where you apply for Atlantic immigration as well, Atlantic immigration program. So just like in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia has two entrepreneurial streams, one general stream and one for international graduates. And again, you'll see that Nova Scotia has its own express entry stream as well. Similar to the other provinces, Nova Scotia's skilled worker stream allows for lower tiered NOCs, so tier 4 and 5 occupations are able to apply. There's also specific language requirements based on an occupation's tier. So if you're in a tier 4 or 5 position, you only need to be able to show that Canadian language benchmark of 4 in language ability. And then Nova Scotia is unique because unlike New Brunswick and Newfoundland, they set up specific streams for specific occupations that they have labor shortages in. So for example, they currently have specific streams for physicians, construction workers, and occupations in demand. And under the occupations in demand stream, the province identifies specific tier 3, 4, and 5 occupations that are in high labor demand within Nova Scotia. So this specific occupation stream, they're different from New Brunswick, for example, where the decision on which occupations are needed in the province are made more internally when they decide which candidates will receive nomination. In Nova Scotia, it's really more upfront on which occupations they're actually looking for, which can be helpful. For PEI, this is a screen grab of their PEI immigration website, similar to the other provinces. And also similar to the other provinces, PEI has an entrepreneurial and express entry streams. As you will see, PEI really breaks down their worker streams into specific categories. PEI also has an international graduate stream for graduates of publicly funded PEI post-secondary institutions. The international graduate stream is available to candidates who have job offers in any tier, so that being from 0 to 5. If you are in a tier 0 to 3 position, you don't need to provide a language test under this category, so that can be beneficial as well. And then similar to Nova Scotia, PEI has a critical worker stream, which is specifically for candidates that are already working full-time in PEI in tier 4 and tier 5 positions. And the purpose of the critical worker stream is to help PEI employers fill intermediate skilled positions that they're unable to fill through the local job market. And under this stream, candidates only need to show, again, the CLB of 4 on their language test. And then there's also the PEI intermediate experience stream, which is for candidates that have been offered a tier 4 position that have a minimum of 6 months of relevant Canadian work experience while being here on an LMIA, so labor market impact assessment work permit. So that's throughout Canada instead of it needing to be just specifically in PEI. And then PEI also has a skilled worker in PEI and skilled workers outside of Canada streams. In order to apply under the in PEI stream, you need to already be employed by an eligible PEI employer and you need to be in a higher skilled position. So that's tier 0 to 3. There are lower language test requirements under the skilled worker in PEI stream, where the candidate either needs a language test showing that CLB of 4, or the employer can provide a form that indicates that they are satisfied and comfortable with the candidate's language proficiency in order to perform the tasks that are needed for the job. So that's a bit unique to that program. And then for the skilled workers outside of PEI stream, employers need to first get authorization from the province in order to issue a job offer. And then similar to the inside PEI stream, this is for the higher skilled, so tier 0 to 3 positions. And the same language test requirements as the inside PEI stream apply. So that's just a quick overview of the different PNP streams. I'll pass back over to Morgan to talk about our MC training now.
Thanks, Emily. And we're going to jump to questions here shortly. So we've left a decent amount of time, hopefully, to address all questions. Just before we do, I did just want to flag that at McInnes Cooper, we do have a program called MC Training, which is a workshop that we offer typically to employer organizations to really dive deeper into a particular topic. As you have hopefully gathered from the discussion here so far, there are a lot of programs, there's a lot to weed through. Probably any one of the slides that we had here today, we could talk about for an hour or more. So, this is meant to be high level, but for something like the AIP, for example, we do have an MC training session where we will have a very detailed workshop going into the process, what employers need to know, how it works, and to give your team the training necessary to work through that process. We also have one that is on the LMIA process, or labor market impact assessment, which is really relevant to the work permit application process, as well as one on employer compliance, as there are strict compliance regimes in place for both the temporary foreign worker program and the international mobility program. So if that's something that you think you might be interested in, we just throw that out there to give you the code. You can go to our website and read about those and learn a bit more. And I think we also have codes for various social media. So, we do post other webinars, articles on topics, legal updates. Immigration is one area of the law where there are frequent updates and ever-changing policies and programs. Things are opening and closing all the time. So we do try to keep everyone up to date on that. So if you're not following us already, certainly encourage you to do so. And then as far as questions, I do see a couple in the chat. Please feel free if you have any others to send them in. I might just get started with one that came in a little earlier when we were talking about the AIP. Someone asked, our employer applied for designation over 10 months ago. It seems IRCC does not process the file despite several requests. What would we recommend? So one thing that I do want to note, Emily alluded to this when she noted that the provincial nominee programs have really been overhauled recently. What has been happening across Canada, but certainly even in Atlantic Canada in the last few years, is the demand under the various provincial programs is higher than ever. And so in the last 2 to 3 years, what we've seen is by the time the fall typically rolls around, the province has used all or almost all of the spaces that they've been allocated to nominate or endorse people under the program. So every province gets X number of nominee certificates and endorsement certificates that they can issue. Historically, the Atlantic Canadian provinces would not use them up in the course of a year. So there was no real concern, even if you submitted your application in December, if you qualified, you'd likely get nominated. But in the last 2 to 3 years, that hasn't been the case. They've had to pause intake at some point in the late summer or early fall. And last year in particular was sort of the highest demand ever. And so when I see that the employer applied for designation over 10 months ago, I mean, that certainly takes us back before the fall. But what I think is probably playing into delays in processing time for something like an employer's designation application is the fact that if you take New Brunswick, for example, no designation applications were being processed from about August or September through until they reopened just last month in February. So when the clock, rolled into 2025, they had to wait and get their allocations from the federal government. as a result of those allocations being fewer than they have been in previous years, so the province's allocations were essentially cut in half in almost every province. They also had to scramble a little bit at the beginning of 2025 to say, how will we manage our intake for this year? Where will we reprioritize our invitations to apply, etc. And so it took until about mid-February before they released the updates to the programs to say how they would do that intake and who would become eligible, and also before they could really start processing things again. So if I look back over the last 10 months, you potentially have a 4 to 6 month chunk of time there where nothing was really happening on the file. Now, that said, it's certainly been in process for a long time. And I note reference to IRCC in the question. It is important to note that it is the province and not IRCC who processes the designation. So it will be the province that the employer would need to follow up with. Typically, the provinces in Atlantic Canada are pretty good about being responsive to questions where they are, smaller provinces. You can usually get a real person to speak to. So if you do have something that's kind of caught in the queue like that and you haven't seen movement since things have reopened, it would be worth following up with them. Emily, I know you had looked at a couple of the questions that came in advance. Maybe I'll send it over to you for a couple of those and we'll
Yeah,
keep working through.
definitely. So we had quite a few questions come in before the presentation, asking for tips on how to find a job in Canada. And we just wanted to quickly note that we're not able to help foreign workers find a job. Really, the point that we get involved in is at the stage where the job offer has already been issued. And then at that stage, we can help the worker and we can help the employer to navigate the process of obtaining status for the worker to actually be able to come to Canada and work for that employer. Um, so there's not really a defined list of employers out there who are looking for foreign workers. The job hunt is really the same as it would be anywhere else. You just have to use any connections that you have through your network and be looking at online job postings to see if there are relevant jobs available for you. There's not really one specific source out there that you should be looking at. It's really just looking at those job postings and seeing if anything fits with the skills and work experience, everything like that that you already have. Um, and then another question that we got quite a bit was people asking about processing times. And for the federal level, the federal government does post most of their anticipated processing times on the IRCC website. One thing to note is that the processing times do regularly change and they're regularly subject to change. So just take the processing times that are posted on there with a little bit of a grain of salt. They can be a tiny bit unreliable. Um, and unfortunately, it kind of is just a wait and see process to have IRCC process the application that they're looking at for you. Um, those are the only two main questions. I don't know if you had any other ones, Morgan, that you noticed within the pre-submitted ones.
Yeah, the other thing I would just note too with respect to the kind of job hunt question, because we did get a lot of questions about, people who I think are at that early stage of job seeking or looking for employer support, is that not every employer will be familiar with what their requirements may or may not be under the various immigration programs. Depending on the employer, some have gone through the process many times, and it is a bit of another language in a way when we talk about tiers and not codes and the language skill levels and all those. Some of them speak that language better than others. And so if you find that you're having a conversation with an employer who, is maybe willing to learn about the process or is, open to the idea of supporting an application, but they just don't know what exactly that would entail, that is something that they can obtain legal advice on as well. And everything, particularly that we've discussed today, is really kind of two parts as far as the individual applicant, but also the employer as an applicant. So whether that is advice that they obtain, from us, certainly it's something we can help with on the employer side as well as the individual side. But that is something that I would recommend, is that the employer have a source of information that is reliable and that can help walk them through so they understand their obligations. That kind of brings me to a second point as far as reliable assistance and representation, which whenever I'm in front of a group, I try to take the opportunity to remind folks that as far as immigration representatives are concerned in Canada, if you have someone that is assisting you with an application, the only individuals who can be paid representatives, meaning you are paying them for their services and they will act on your behalf with the provincial or federal governments, are immigration lawyers like ourselves or registered immigration consultants. You can search within Law Society websites to make sure that a particular lawyer is a practicing lawyer in good standing. You can also search online to ensure that an immigration consultant is a registered consultant. Unfortunately, there is a lot of fraud within the immigration world in general. There are bad actors who are not registered or not regulated who may hold themselves out to be able to assist you. You want to make sure that you're getting that information and assistance from a reliable source. Keep your fraud prevention tips in mind, that you're meeting with them either virtually with video on or in their office, and that they aren't impersonating a lawyer or a registered consultant, because unfortunately that does happen. So you do want to make sure that you are doing your due diligence that way to make sure you get the best advice possible. And one of the questions that had come in as a pre-submitted question was sort of, what do you wish people knew before applying for a work permit or PR? I mean, that would be a major one, because we've seen too many people who kind of get themselves into trouble when they're working with someone who they shouldn't be working with. Another thing, though, when it comes to what should you know before applying, I think a couple things are, it does take a long time. It's an involved process. There's a lot of documentation requirements. Nothing is guaranteed, right? And that is to the same tune of making sure that you're working with someone reputable. A major red flag would really be anyone who is offering a guarantee, because at the end of the day, it's the provincial government and it's IRCC, the federal department, who are the decision makers. We can give you the best advice possible, tell you what you qualify for, how to navigate the immigration process, and look for pitfalls as far as your eligibility and documentation are concerned. But we can't guarantee an approval. They have to make that approval decision at the end of the day. So going into it knowing that that is the case, and that the approval is not guaranteed, and you want to make sure you're doing everything correctly at every step to set yourself up for the best amount of success as possible. That's certainly very important. For any employers on the line, I would also say an important thing to understand from the outset are your employer compliance obligations, what that means as far as ensuring that you're complying with the terms associated with an individual's work permit or their job offer. So making sure you look into that and you understand that from the outset is definitely very important. A couple of questions coming in through the chat here. So I've seen a couple questions that sort of relate a bit to remote work. Someone who has maybe worked in Ontario, for example, but has relocated to Nova Scotia or New Brunswick. The federal government and provincial governments have not done a great job really of recognizing sort of the remote work world that we are in right now. And in fact, with the revamping of the provincial nominee programs recently, they have particularly made a point to make reference to a need for a physical structure of the employer. So the employer not only needs to be registered to operate and do business in the province where the individual is residing and is reporting to work every day, but they also have to have a physical office structure in order to qualify under these provincial nominee programs or the AIP programs. So part of that is this question of the intake, right? There is such a high demand for applicants under these programs that they seemingly have decided to focus on applicants who are physically here inside a particular province with a employer who is on the ground. We always hope that things will shift a little bit to be more, have more recognition for the nature of hybrid or remote work. But if you are in the province with an employer who does not have a physical structure whatsoever, then that will pose a problem under the programs as they exist currently. Of course, always subject to change. There was also a question of whether New Brunswick has a stream for international graduate entrepreneurs. So you would have noted from some of Emily's slides that PEI, for example, Newfoundland, there is a specific stream under the entrepreneur category. It's broken out into one for international graduates and then one just for entrepreneurs in general. New Brunswick doesn't make that distinction, so we have the one business immigration stream. There's nothing to my knowledge that would prevent someone who is an international graduate from then applying if they met the criteria of the program otherwise, but they don't make a particular distinction to have international graduate entrepreneurs apply under a pathway of their own. And one other question I saw a couple times from the questions that came in prior to the chat, maybe we will finish on that as I think we're close to the end here, but questions with respect to options for retirees, retirement plan inside Canada, moving, and this gets a little bit to the question of those who are maybe over 55 or 59 who are looking to apply for permanent residency in Canada. Canada really does not have a retirement specific pathway. Some countries, if you look, there's a particular net worth requirement or investment requirement that you can then have a residence visa based on that. We don't have such a thing in Canada. So really you'd be looking at, if we go back to those initial categories, like a family class application, if you have a Canadian family member who's eligible to sponsor you for permanent residency, or you'd be looking at an economic pathway like those that we have discussed here today, where you are going to be working in Canada, you have a job offer, and depending on your age, your retirement age, you're probably looking at something under the AIP if you're going with an economic class application. So, it's a question that we get fairly often, but there is not a particular pathway that is strictly for retirees if you don't intend to work in Canada. And I think, look, with that, we're at 12 o'clock on the dot, so we'll pause there. I will invite you, you should have our contact information from the invitation to this session. So if you have questions that we haven't addressed or you'd like to set some time to consult with Emily or myself, please feel free to reach out. But otherwise, we thank you very much for joining us, and stay tuned for future webinars throughout the year.